When I started excavations and working in Mauritius, it was because there was very little understanding of our archaeohistoric past. In fact, I was told there is no archaeology in Mauritius, and it broke my heart, because ultimately we have in Mauritius, as in many parts of the world, particularly South Africa, for example, as a connection, a shared history of enslavement followed by indenture. And the conditions under which people lived were fundamentally different, but the conditions under which enslaved and indentured people often worked did share similarities. And I have to say, I'm a descendant of enslaved populations who came to Mauritius. I've had the good fortune to be able to follow up on my lineage. And it's really a poignant moment to find yourself connected to your land and to your country in such a precise way. And for Mauritius in particular, we've been told constantly that there is no indigenous population, given a Europeanized perspective on our part of the world. Well, we're creating that nation. We've created that nation out of a shared history of enslavement and indenture, and coming through a very difficult time in our history. And that's definitely been a very important motivator for the work that I do. So the Indian Ocean world really is something that we need to concentrate on much more effectively than we have been doing. Consider this our oldest sea. We have, in actual geological terms, it isn't, it's the youngest sea, but in terms of the human movements within this oceanographic basin, we've had people who we are almost certain reach Australia, now as Aboriginal peoples of that nation, who made that crossing, who made the voyage around the Indian Ocean rim at least 70,000 years ago, which is a staggering concept when we think about it. Even more important is to consider that before humans were human, Homo floresiensis actually using very basic craft made across the Flores. So we've got a situation where we have a really long history of human mobility in this region that has largely gone unnoticed. That's taking the archaeological perspective, the longer, deeper time context. When we look historically, we've got a situation of a great deal of human mobility in that region throughout recent and more ancient histories, which we've tended to underplay because we've focused on the Atlantic diasporas when it comes to things like enslavement and the movement of people for labor. Whatever term we want to use, we really need to underscore the fact that this is a much more heterogeneous location when it comes to histories of enslavement. We probably have some of the oldest documentation, shall we call it documentation, but historical archives in that sense actually describe the purchase of a human being. And there's been a long and very varied conceptualization of how people can be enslaved. There's been very different models applied to enslavement that are guided by religion, that are guided by social norms. So this entire region, where we're talking about Africa, Asia, all the way over to Southeast Asia, have had different traditions of enslavement that we've tended to not really pay as much attention to. So the history itself is very old. The history of enslavement is very old here. And when it comes to the more recent periods of enslavement associated with European colonization, again, very varied. We've got Dutch, French, British iterations, Portuguese iterations of mobility movement in the area. And so coerced labor, indentured labor, they really have their seeds, unfortunately, in this oceanic basin. Labor diaspora is a term that we've used very much to describe the great variations in different movements of different types of people. And when I say different movements, I mean people who are moving as part of enslaved labor, and also people who are moving as part of indentured labor. So not under conditions of enslavement, receiving some pay for the work, for example, but ultimately still being moved around in order to provide a workforce, certainly for plantations and other forms of labor around the rim. We've got a very strong overemphasis on labor movements, focus on the Atlantic diaspora. And that really tends to emphasize the Middle Passage, the movement of people from the west coast, Atlantic coast of Africa to the Atlantic coast of the Americas, broadly defined. And that tends to miss the fact that there is a large labor diaspora in the Indian Ocean world itself. And that's taking populations from Madagascar, from Mozambique, through places like Mauritius, around the Cape, through the Atlantic, towards the Americas, particularly to places like Brazil at this time, which was a huge market and absorbed huge numbers of enslaved labor. On the other side, something that we know even less about and emphasize even less is the fact that there is a movement of people through the Indian Ocean world to Southeast Asia and across the Pacific to the Pacific coast of the Americas. So again, we've tended to miss the fact that the Indian Ocean world is really central to forms of enslavement that actually take place not only in this world region, but also within the Atlantic context as well. The distinctions between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are varied. What we've tended to do, the early histories of the regions themselves, emphasize the Atlantic because of a form of historical narrative that could be developed, one that emphasized the numbers of people being moved. And when you consider potentially 14 million souls moved across the Atlantic, you can understand justifiably why there was an emphasis on that type of historical narrative in the past. When we look at the Indian Ocean world, which has a more heterogeneous context to enslavement, a much deeper time depth, varied populations being moved, a much more complex mosaic of traditions around enslavement, we understand why maybe initially there was an emphasis on the Atlantic world, also because we need to also take into account where our educational traditions stem today. We've got Western European and Western world narratives that are emphasizing historical relationships into the past. We're using history as our main source of evidence. And ultimately, it's quite easy to study the history of your own language or European languages. It becomes more complex to study histories in other languages that may be quite ancient themselves. So that's just providing some context to why it is we've had an emphasis on the Atlantic. Ultimately, if we overemphasize the Atlantic, we miss the fact that there is so much more still to be learned from the traditions of enslavement that were and indentured labor, labor provision directly from this region, that help us to understand both of these contexts in a much more fluid and dynamic way. Forms of educational systems that looked at history in a very particular way in that part of the world, in North American context specifically, and then more recently into Britain, for example, looking at historical relationships around the colonial period. When we take that same context, it's very easy to study resources that are relatively close to you versus those that can be a bit more distant. Also, the complexity of looking at the different types of narratives and as they related one to the other, it's understandable why it is that there was an initial emphasis on the Atlantic world. That can't continue. We really need to move beyond that context, look at the complexity of this region, look at the complexity of the relationships between these regions, and draw in the Pacific, because these were connected ocean basins. Archaeology has a very important role to play in our understanding of narratives of enslavement and indenture and labor more generally. Now, why have I separated those out? Enslavement as a historical context, within its historical context, indenture with its historical context, labor, all of those have different material signatures. History is approaching all of those three contexts from the perspective of the written word narratives. Absolutely fantastic, phenomenal work that we really need to do. But we need to overlay the different scales of evidence. The material evidence is at the most fundamental. We've always traditionally thought of archaeology as having limited implications for the study of enslavement because enslaved people had very few material objects. And increasingly, certainly from our own work in the Mauritian context, we're seeing that even from very small numbers of artifacts, with a scientific approach, an environmental archaeological approach, we can really explore entirely new ways of understanding these forms of labor provision, how the lifeways of these individuals actually played out day to day, and their relationships between each other and the broader society. And I'll just give you one example from the grave of an enslaved person. We've actually recovered the evidence from a pipe of marijuana use, of drug use, we call them drugs, but actually medicinal plant use that come from Mexico. So we've got this very great context of the movement of these plant substances, completely cryptic, unknown to the historical record. In fact, the relationships with the psychoactive agents from Mexico were unknown to science. They were turning up in the grave of an enslaved person 150 years before we've got them in the scientific Western context. And they're being used to deal with the pain of working as an enslaved person. So we're really starting to understand at a very precise, very personal, very significant level that history can't always attend to. We can approach that through the archaeological record. The relationships between Mauritius and the Cape are really significant. It was a failure of Dutch colonization in Mauritius, which ultimately led to the movement of the Dutch to the Cape in the aims of establishing a base here for the VOC. And so ultimately, there was a movement of enslaved people, first to Mauritius, that effectively marooned and became a great problem for that colonial group, that forced the movement of the Dutch here. And again, establishing an outpost, establishing an enslaved population here is also. So one was critical to the other. And it might seem quite complex to put those two things into a juxtaposition. Mauritius is small, one of the smallest nations in Africa, versus what we understand of South Africa now. But we must detach from those contexts. It really was a case of colonial groups generally making settlements around the coastal regions of Africa, having very little capacity to penetrate deeper into those regions. So actually, when we look at it from that perspective, Mauritius and the Cape, there's much greater relationships between them, considering the time context that we're speaking about. In terms of regions that underscore the movements of labor, we're actually describing something that's extremely unfortunate, because we're talking about those regions that exploited their traditions of enslavement to support the new demands for labor that were galvanized by European expansion. So regions like Mozambique, Madagascar, but also parts of South Asia and India in particular, which have long-standing traditions of the movements of people under conditions of enslavement, those traditions were harnessed and new relationships created where the middlemen and the plantation owners and so on were now people of European descent, as well as Gujarati, as well as other local populations, that ultimately caused a much greater movement of these enslaved peoples to meet the demand that had really radically changed during this period, as we saw the establishment of plantations, for example, in places like Mauritius. But they were really using established principles of enslavement and then setting up new posts in many places to sell enslaved people. Is extremely important for us because we've got various scales that we can draw on. We've actually got this extremely complex vessel, the ship itself, that we know moved people. It's connected almost invariably, very tightly, to a historical record as well. We've got a historical record of the movements of these ships within the region and beyond. But what's interesting is that then to dig down into, literally dig down underwater, into the wreck itself, into the artifact. And certainly since the advances of scuba diving, it's been possible to do very refined, detailed surveys of individual wrecks, look at the types of goods that were moved when we have the cargoes intact in situ. And then beyond that is to actually knit together from both historical records and the actual artifacts themselves, the actual wrecks themselves, an understanding of just how many of these vessels were moved and how many people were moved on these vessels. And finally, there's the context that is very rare but very precise, the cases where we know, for example, Tromelin, where a group of enslaved people were deposed on the island with an understanding that another ship would be coming back to pick them up, and they spent years there waiting for that vessel to come back, having to use the wreckage of other vessels to create settlements. And those are really precise, really informative examples of the abuse of people in a completely different context, still tied to enslavement. So the point I want to make is the complexification, the way that we can deal and understand nuances, and the way that we bridge scales between historical artifacts and historical records. I can't emphasize the role of islands enough. The reason that these islands, and we should understand something quite particular to the Indian Ocean world, while islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic were colonized in some cases thousands of years ago, places like Mauritius, the Seychelles, the Mascarenes, for example, and also the Seychelles, were not colonized until the recent European period of expansion. So they're some of the last places on Earth to have been colonized. And the drastic change that took place is as a consequence of this colonial movement. And why they were so drastically changed is because of their significance. Initially, they're important as nodes, as refreshing points, and then they become significant in their own right. Not all of them. They had to have the right conditions. But Mauritius in particular, they had the right conditions. They had two natural harbors, Port Louis and Mayberg. And it also had land that could be transformed into plantation. So 96.5% forest becomes about 2% forest, and we've got huge tracts of land that are completely transformed into sugar plantation. Those activities happen on a scale that are so ecologically transformative and damaging, they're harbingers for the world at large if we're not cautious about what we do when we pursue agricultural crops to this extent. But ultimately, their significance within a historical context is that they allowed these empires really to gain mobility, to be strategically capable within this region, because it simply wasn't possible, unless you were hugging the coast, to traverse these distances without these island nodes as stopping off points. And as I say, ultimately they become really strong centers of production themselves. And Mauritius is again a good point to compare with. It was one of the few places, one of only, I think only 2 islands, perhaps not the only island, where you could produce gunpowder during the French period. So that tells you something about its significance. The Dutch East India Company has a role of extreme significance because they operate in such a way, they're really the first venture that operates in the type of model where you can effectively have the backing financially, a debt system, shall we say, a loan system, shall we say, where you can actually have financial backing to move goods around that you haven't yet purchased in effect. So it's the sort of thing that we take for granted today, but it was actually initiated by the Dutch East India Company. And that allows goods to be purchased, bought and sold. There's huge profits to be made. And at the same time, ultimately, there's a need to move people around at that same time for producing some of these goods in enclaves that are controlled by these hegemonic empires. So the company itself starts to create the types of systems that are then adopted by other colonial groups. There's got to be a distinction between the type of maritime adventure and maritime movements, for example, that we see with the early Portuguese movements into this region, versus a much more capitalist mode of operation that we see by the time Dutch, British, French are moving into the region themselves. If we take the Atlantic model as our standard for the period of enslavement, for colonial expansion, we do ourselves a disservice. It's extremely important to understand that populations in the modern day are suffering because of the legacies of colonialism. However, the Atlantic experience was one iteration of enslavement. The Indian Ocean world is another, and a very varied one. If we are to have a true understanding of the consequences of colonialism, the consequences of enslavement, the consequences of labor diaspora movements, indenture, we really need a holistic understanding. Why that's significant today is that if we take Human Rights Watch, for example, they're very clear that we've never had as many people under conditions of enslavement. A conservative estimate is 20 million people who are suffering the same types of restrictions, if not the same brutality, although in some cases we do have brutal conditions, as we have seen in the past. We increasingly understand the way that cultural attributes, cultural resources were critical for both indentured laborers and enslaved populations to maintain a connection with their past. And so medicinal plants, elements of dance, music, but in particular the descriptive way in which dance today, for example, siga, as we understand it, our siga, the traditional siga typique, is now recognized as UNESCO Intangible Heritage. It actually developed as a form of dance that could be performed whilst the legs were shackled. That's our oral understanding of it. So the point about the way that you respond even to the physical constraints of the moment through dance is absolutely typified in a place like Mauritius. There's really strong connections by both descendant of indentured populations, also descendant of enslaved people, to connect with their past through their cultural features. And for indentured people, that's through Bhojpuri, through language, through music, through dance. For African descent populations who couldn't maintain their language, couldn't maintain their names, they have been able to create new forms of dance, new forms of music that thankfully are being recognized on a world level now.